Owning a boat comes with a number of perks, like being able to fling your favorite fishing rod around. And here's another perk. Geico's boat insurance covers your boat and your belongings. And with specialist support from agents that are as passionate about boating as you are, there's so much value that you'll want to high-five someone. But not while you're holding your fishing rod. That's a prized possession. So hold on tight with both hands and keep it covered through boat insurance. Get more with Geico.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Just before dawn on November 10th, 1971, John List closed the front door to his 14-room home at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey. He'd slept well, he'd carried out his plan the day before without too many hitches, and he'd adjusted well, he thought, to the unexpected. He'd carefully cut himself out of all the family pictures around the house. He turned down the thermostat to keep the home extremely cool. He had left the lights on and made sure that the mail, newspaper, and milk deliveries had been halted. No need to have clutter piling up. He had closed out his bank accounts, making sure to cash the savings bonds his mother had left in his care. He had left notes to explain why he was leaving and how he had done what he'd done. He apologized. He had also decided that the house shouldn't feel so empty the next time someone came through the door, so he left the radio on, tuned to the classical music he loved so much, knowing that the only interruption to that would be news at the top of every hour. He could hear it even now through the home's fancy schmancy intercom system. He had not exactly been happy in that house, but like so many chapters of his life, it had started out well there, with all those plans to do all that refurbishment that the house needed. It was such a great house. Large, old-world charm, teak everywhere, a ballroom, a butler's pantry, all hints of a glamorous existence before they had moved in. An entire top-floor apartment that had been his mother's first home outside of Michigan. It had once been used by servants. Helen loved that fact. But things had fallen apart, hadn't they? So he carefully locked the door behind him and carried a single piece of luggage to his car. He then drove the aged Chevrolet Impala to John F. Kennedy Airport. In his pocket was $2,500 in cash. A man could go pretty far on that if he minded his pennies in 1971. He'd always liked the idea of seeing the West. Maybe it was time to check it out. That'd be a lark. Not that he was a man who knew much about larks. He hadn't much trusted anyone who acted on impulse, and this was not an impulse. This had all been exceptionally well thought out. He was, after all, a planner, a guy with an MBA in accounting from the University of Michigan who once imagined he'd head up one of those top accounting firms with hundreds of employees. The kind of precision he demanded of himself was something he knew mattered to those who valued numbers all lined up in rows. People who made the books balance, literally and figuratively, were among the most revered. He had thought he was destined for that, but now he knew something about how God dispensed blessings, how he answered prayers, or didn't. When John List left, he was wearing his requisite suit and tie because that's what men did. He'd even fascinated the neighbors in Westfield by regularly mowing his lawn weekly in the spring and summer, dressed in his suit with his nice shoes on. Some would have called him prim and stodgy. Odd, maybe, but polite. He knew he could be rigid, but he had 3 children to raise, and that was hard as they were coming of age in the late 60s and early 70s when things were changing so rapidly and so wrongly. and it all made no sense. His children weren't even interested in church anymore. What does that say to a man who never missed a Sunday, who read the Bible nightly and understood its commandments and was well aware of its parables about the wicked? How do you head that wicked at the pass? These were wicked times. But John List was trying to make it right, and that is why he had dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. Still, he wanted to give himself some breathing room. He knew it wouldn't last, but what was done was done. So he closed the door on all that was left in that house. You know, the stuff you couldn't take with you when you decided to go. It would be a month before anyone would find what List had left behind, and 18 years before he would be back in Westfield to account for it. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Cornbread. I'll let Scott, my partner, talk about this one.
Oh, easily. I love cornbread, and not just the bread, which is delicious, but this product, with a capital C cornbread, is one of my favorites. Because life's been a little crazy lately, and cornbread hemp gummies are a huge help.
Yeah, they've fast become our go-to on weekends, huh?
Yep, cornbread hemp CBD gummies are made to help you feel better, whether you're stressed or feeling some discomfort or just needing a little relaxation. They only use the best part of the hemp plant, the flower, for the purest and most potent CBD.
All products are third-party lab tested and USDA organic to ensure safety and purity.
Right now, Crimes of the Centuries listeners can save 30% on their first order. Just head to cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC at checkout. That's cornbreadhemp.com/COTC. Use code COTC.
Jessica Remo, co-creator of the NJ.com podcast Father Wants Us Dead, told Nightline that List, though a nondescript man when he lived in that town, was anything but. After 1971.
It was a real-life horror story in Westfield. There's an entire generation of people that were afraid John List was coming for them. He was on the run for 18 years. He became known as the Bogeyman of Westfield.
He was hardly the type. John Emil List was the only child of a Michigan couple who were good, solid, thrifty Midwesterners, ardent Lutherans, strict adherents to God's rules, which included regular worship and a reverence for living orderly lives. His mother was a few decades younger than his stern father, who was a storekeeper, the enterprising son of German immigrants. His father's imposing presence made it clear that young John was not to be pampered, heard, seen, or indulged. According to the book Death Sentence by New York Times reporter John Sharkey, the boy did not have a bedroom, but slept on the family sofa as a child in the family's Bay City home, responsible for folding his sheets before the others rose. He was not memorable to those who knew him growing up, as reporters would later discover. If thought of at all, he was considered a mama's boy who ruffled no feathers, never disobeyed, was polite, well-dressed, and without opinion. Raised in the Depression, List graduated from high school in 1943 in the midst of the Second World War. His father died in 1944 while he was in Louisiana getting infantry training as a private in the U.S. Army. His mother, thanks to his father's thrift, could easily manage the rest of her life. After seeing some brief action in Europe, the war ended and List went home, enrolled, per his mother's suggestion, at the University of Michigan, majored in business administration, and got his master's in accounting. He then got a job at the prestigious accounting firm Ernst & Ernst in Detroit, making a pretty nice salary of $56.25 a week. He was going places. Then, the Korean War called on the Army reservist to report again for duty, this time favoring his accounting skills over anything he could do with a gun. Awkward in almost all social situations, he met an elegant, slim, and quietly beautiful single mother named Helen Taylor at a bowling alley while he was stationed in Virginia. Just that day, she had laid her first husband, a Korean War hero, in his grave 6 months after he was killed by enemy fire. They'd had a daughter together, Brenda, who was 9. Things moved fast, with the inexperienced John even engaging quickly in premarital sex with Helen, something he knew was wrong. She soon told John she was pregnant, and almost exactly 2 months after they had first met, they married, only to find out that, she wasn't pregnant after all. It only dawned on him 5 decades later that she might have invented that pregnancy. Ordered to repost in San Francisco, the newlyweds took John's mother, Alma, with them. Yeah, it was cozy and not much to Helen's liking. John, Helen soon learned, lacked a backbone. He did, however, tend to move heaven and earth to please her. When John was mustered out for the second time, he and Helen and Brenda went back to Detroit, and Alma, his mom, went back to Bay City. The Lists began to live the post-war life so readily identifiable to any baby boomer. In pretty quick succession, beginning with Patty's birth in January 1955, they had 3 children together, moving around Michigan to better jobs and better prospects. Helen, though, began to let her older daughter Brenda take over a lot of the housework and babysitting. This allowed her to get off her feet, something her doctor had supposedly recommended, and it also gave her plenty of time to spend money, which was fast becoming a favorite pastime. She began to shop, drink, and take depressants and hypnotic sedatives. To her husband's utter horror, she stopped going to church, which meant that John, who was a Sunday worshiper from birth, a parish treasurer, and Sunday school teacher, dressed his babies for their religious instruction weekly. In Sharkey's book, the author quotes a Kalamazoo neighbor saying, quote, "Those children didn't seem to have a mother, but they had the most expensive clothes in the neighborhood. The playpen alone must have cost more than $100, end quote. The playpen was notable, as Helen would often put the children outside in the playpen, leave them there to get fresh air, and return hours later to check on them. It was a scandal. Meanwhile, John was politely being asked to look for work elsewhere. His management style was to be persnickety, rigid, and so precise as to be unable to adjust to changes to which no business is immune. Change. He did not like it. He did not understand it. Stephen Simmering, a New Jersey forensic psychiatrist assigned to diagnose him later, said this.
Certainly he was not psychotic or out of touch with reality or hearing voices, nothing like this. He was rigid beyond rigid. We have in medical and psychiatric diagnosis different classes of diagnoses. The big bad ones you think about are psychotic diagnoses like schizophrenia, where people believe they're God or they hear Jesus or they do things which make no sense. But there are other classes of mental disorder that one wouldn't even think of as illness, just peculiarities. These are called personality disorders. There's some people who have different types of personality. He meets clearly the criteria for obsessive compulsive personality. These are individuals who are emotionally isolated. They're not cruel, but they're emotionally isolated. They don't show feelings. They don't have very much in the way of feelings. They don't cry a whole lot. They're not emotional. They are very, very detail-oriented. They rationalize things that happen. They don't lie as an antisocial person would do, but they'll rationalize it. He is so focused on little details, he misses the large picture, is not good at picking up emotions in other people, is not empathic.
To make matters worse, the 1960s were just getting started, and they were going to bring nothing but a constant string of radical, earth-shattering, soul-shaking change to everyone alive during the era. What was a man like List to do? Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Home Chef. Meal kits often market themselves as an easy meal prep solution, but you know what? I'm often disappointed.
I've seen it. Sometimes those recipes are complicated and overlong and just exhausting.
Fortunately, Home Chef knows that struggle and delivers fresh, delicious meal kits that respect your time. Users of leading meal kits have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease.
It's got a lot going for it. It has over 30 options a week, serves a variety of dietary needs, and is economical. Home Chef customers save an average of $86 per month on groceries.
I've never felt grocery bills as much as I'm feeling them right now, so that's a big deal. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering my listeners 18 free meals plus free dessert for life and, of course, free shipping on your first box. Go to homechef.com/COTC.
That's homechef.com/COTC for 18 free meals and free dessert for life.
Homechef.com/COTC. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. In the early 1960s, the List family moved to Rochester, New York, where he worked for a small startup called Xerox. He was growing more fastidious, and Helen spent money faster than he could make it. She was certain that people judged you by the quality of the shoe you wore, which mattered to her. What didn't? That they could hardly make their bills and had no savings. Helen would only live to please Helen. Much later, after she had helped push the family to near bankruptcy, after she had neglected her children to stay in bed to drink and smoke and read, it would be revealed that her dead hero husband, whose manliness and bravery she regularly threw into John's face, had given her syphilis. She was, in other words, actively dying, her brain in continual atrophy, a consequence of untreated syphilis. It's something she surely must have known at least something about. It was probably why she had insisted that she and John marry in Maryland. Unlike Virginia, where they lived, Maryland did not require a premarital blood test, which should not and does not excuse John for what came next, but it surely didn't help. List, the only son of a hardworking father, would judge himself solely on how well he could provide for his family. He compensated for his wife's deficiencies, juggling their precarious finances and continuing to let her spend while sleeping in separate bedrooms, the children an afterthought. After 5 years at Xerox, he alone saw himself as CEO material. Others knew he had gone as far as he could. He was not well-spoken, he grew red-faced and blotchy under pressure, he had no managerial skills, and he was altogether too square, too prim, too fussy, too mousy. He was just not a guy others could relate to. I mean, man, he was just so odd. He even read the paper, explained his sister-in-law Jean, so methodically that he folded each page over so he could read each piece in its entirety from front to back, so that when he was finished, he could refold it so it looked as if it had never been opened. At work, he asked for promotions he never got. Finally, the folks at Xerox told him to look elsewhere for work. After a while, he found that in New Jersey as the vice president and controller of First National Bank of Jersey City, a job that required him to rustle up new accounts. He and Helen found a house in Westfield, one of the finest suburbs in all of New Jersey. It had once been a commanding kind of residence. It had the rather preposterous name of Breeze Knoll, but it now badly needed fresh outdoor paint and all kinds of interior refurbishment of its teak fireplaces, its Tiffany chandelier, its servants' quarters, and its billiard room. Valued at $100,000, or a bit more than $1 million in today's money, the List bought it for $50,000, or a healthy $500,000 if you bought the massive fixer-upper yesterday. The 10% down payment came from John's mother, 79-year-old Alma, who only asked that in return she move into the private third floor for the rest of her days. His wife was thrilled with the house. She and John made endless plans for a complete reno to return it to its former glory, fill it with resplendent furniture, and give gracious living a try. Things felt better for John. His mother had moved in, his children believed in God, were well-dressed and reasonably well-behaved. He loved his job title and loved his status. But there was a problem. He could not land new customers or big accounts and was out of work in a year. This was when a life that was being held together by the barest of ropes was cut free of its moorings. List, refusing to tell his family about his job loss, dressed every day, drove to the rail station, and proceeded all day to hang out there or at the library. He then returned at night with no one the wiser. He did this for a year, taking small, quote-unquote, loans out from the account he shared with his mother, who had given him power of attorney because of her age. He would pay them back, he told himself. He just needed to keep afloat. He did enough to keep up appearances, but the house projects remained untouched. Occasionally, in the ensuing years, he would get a job, but it wouldn't last. Then Helen's disease became more pronounced. She needed surgery, maybe even institutionalization. Costly in any case, John wanted his wife at home. Having run through an enormous amount of money, all stolen from his mother, he began to take out home loans just to buy groceries. His daughter Patty was becoming interested in the theater. At 16, she was blonde and tall and quite pretty. Her father fretted about who she would become. He considered her choice of career immoral. To add fuel to that fire, she told people she was a witch. Unusual, yes, but she was new to all these hormones and lived with a religious zealot. What do you expect? She was a young woman who had a crush on her drama teacher, worked part-time, met her obligations, and made deadlines. Her brothers were equally as typical of their age and showed signs of growing up as decent, hard-working men. But their father, whom they called father, simply did not understand how to regain control of them, his finances, or, well, anything. By late 1971, as he would later explain, he had formulated a step-by-step plan to save them, all while, quote, they were still in a state of grace, end quote. Whatever the hell that meant. He took his plan a step forward one night around the dinner table when he told his family that they were all going to die soon. Then he asked them if they would prefer to be buried or cremated. The children, horrified, said buried. He spoke to ABC News' Connie Chung in 2002 saying, quote, I remember talking about funerals and cremation and burials. I thought I was being real clever, end quote. Clever? No. He had scared his children badly. Patty even talked to her mentor at the drama club about it, saying she feared her father was about to kill the family. Teenagers, so dramatic, Ed Iliano thought. On November 9th, a date he had circled on his calendar weeks before, John List got up early to hear his children preparing for their day. After Patty left for school that morning, Freddie and Johnny found no milk in the refrigerator and also took off, braving the cold without breakfast. That's when List went to fetch his guns. Located, as he had known they would be, in the file cabinet he had marked guns and ammo, he took out a small .22 caliber automatic pistol that had been his father's. Then he pulled out something he'd bought off a fellow soldier just after World War II, a 9mm automatic that, ironically enough, used a cartridge that was known as a peacemaker. List had heard the milkman enter the back of the house, read the note that said to hold all deliveries until further notice, and carry the empty bottles back to his truck. Check. Helen made it downstairs a few minutes later, put the kettle on in the kitchen, and when it signaled the water was boiling, she made herself some instant coffee and sat down to drink it. That's when her husband of 20 years slowly approached her from behind, his fancy World War II pistol at the ready. She turned slightly and was looking up over her shoulder when he shot her in the jaw. It was over before he'd really gotten a good chance to take aim. He fired a few shots in her direction for good measure, though they didn't hit her. She was dead before she'd hit the floor. Knowing that his mother likely would have heard the shots, he wasted no time in heading to the third floor. He found Alma waiting for some toast to pop up, a pat of butter on a knife in her hand. He shot her at point-blank range, just above her left eye. He had imagined he'd line her up with the rest of the dead, but soon realized a dead body is a heavy thing. So he rolled her up in a carpet runner and put her in an upstairs hall closet. Check. Back to the issue of where to put Helen. He couldn't leave her in the kitchen for fear the children would see her and think to run. Pulling her by her feet, he dragged her to the ballroom, which was a good 40 feet across the house. He then gathered up 3 Boy Scout issue sleeping bags, putting Helen in one, careful to turn her face away from him. He then covered it with a kitchen towel. He had to clean up the blood that had trailed from the kitchen and then mopped up the big mess he'd left in the kitchen with paper towels and newspapers. He put those in a bag, which he left at the back door. He showered, stopping first to wipe his bloodied hands on the sheets of his wife's bed and vomit in the toilet, then put on a suit and tie to go downstairs to write notes to his children's schools and to their places of work, explaining that they would be gone for a while because their grandmother in North Carolina had fallen ill. Check. He canceled his own appointment with a guy who employed him to sell life insurance. Check. He was apparently ahead of schedule now, so he decided he would rake leaves in his suit and a proper coat. It was just above freezing, a record low for that part of New Jersey so early in November. Best to keep up appearances. Then he made himself a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table. Patty called at noon to say she wasn't feeling good and asked her father to come get her from school. This was highly irregular, but okay, he would pick her up. When they got to the house, he rushed to get ahead of her so he could shoot her in the back of the head when she entered through the kitchen door. Check. He dragged her dead body into the ballroom to place beside her mother. Then it was errand time. First to the bank to cash a check on his joint account with his wife, post office, bank again to write a check for cash on the account he held with his mother. He cashed out her savings bonds. Check. He was back home in time to get a call from Freddie, who wanted to come home early from his part-time job, as they had told him Patty had called in sick. He was very worried about what had happened to her. His father dutifully picked up the 13-year-old and put a bullet in his brain as soon as they got home. Check. Things were speeding up. Soon enough, John List saw his older son coming up the driveway a good hour before he was due home. Soccer practice had been called off due to the cold weather. His father moved to get into place. Some noise or some kind of intuition made 15-year-old Johnny enter the house alerted that something was off. He turned in time to see his father pointing at him with a gun. He managed to swerve enough that the first bullet missed his head but hit the upper back. A second shot didn't finish him off. The boy wouldn't give up. Continuing to try to crawl to some kind of safety now, he must have known that his father was now aiming at him and unloading all of the bullets left in the .22. At last, the boy stopped moving. Check. The father of now 3 dead children then moved the last to die in the ballroom where his brother and sister lay face up. List said a prayer, commending their souls to heaven. He called the drama group later that evening to explain Patty's absence and sat down to write letters to Helen's mother, her sister, and to his mother's sister. Each said that, by now, they knew what had happened. To his mother's sister, he added, quote, "For a number of reasons, this was the only solution that I could see for the family, and to save Mother untold anguish over that result, I felt it best that she be relieved from this veil of tears. Please accept my sincerest condolences." End quote. To Helen's sister, Jean, quote, "I'm sorry that it had to go this way, but when I couldn't support them, I couldn't let them go on welfare, etc. Please accept my sincere sympathy." End quote. To his mother-in-law, he said much the same, but added, quote, "Also, at this time, I know that they were all Christians. I couldn't be sure of that in the future as the children grow up." End quote. Growing up being something that they now would never do. Then he wrote a 5-page letter on yellow legal paper addressed to Pastor E.A. Redwinkle of Redeemer Lutheran Church. It included all his reasons, excuses really, for his actions. That he didn't want them to live in poverty, that he didn't want them to stray from the church, that he was worried about Patty's desire to be an actress. those people would draw her away from her faith. He did what he had to do. Then he outlined how he wanted Helen and the children cremated and his mother's body sent to Frankenmuth, where she had grown up. He asked to be dropped from the church's rolls. Here's an actor's voice reading the letter on forensic files.
I know that what has been done is wrong. I'm sure many will say, how can anyone do such a horrible thing? Mother is in the hallway in the attic. She was too heavy to move. At least I'm certain that all have gone to heaven now.
He spoke about the killings obliquely.
John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer.
He added that, quote, "It may seem cowardly to have always shot them from behind, but I didn't want any of them to know, even at the last second, that I had to do this to them," end quote. Which was not true. Only Patty had been shot in the back of the head. Everyone else saw who was about to end their lives, Johnny especially.
I said some prayers for them all, from the hymn book. That was the least I could do.
He put all the notes, letters, and directives to those who found them on the desk in his study so that they were easily seen. He then ate dinner and, after a long day, washed up and went to bed. He had saved some souls today, he decided. He would figure out how to save his own when Jesus asked. John List didn't take a plane and didn't need the passport he'd thought to bring along. He got a rail ticket west and got off in Denver. He changed his name to Robert Peter Clark, shaved a few years off his age, got a job as a short-order cook, and got to be pretty good at it. He read about the finding of his family's bodies in a local newspaper, a small piece done by the Associated Press, picked up for those out west who like to have a little bit of news from back east. He lived in a little trailer, made a friend or two, worried that the police would be there any day, but they didn't show. The Westfield police and the FBI were a whole month behind him and totally exasperated by their lack of progress in finding him. They'd watched Breeze Knoll for a few months, thinking he might return, but he didn't. Then, 9 months after the murders, the house that had contained all that horror burned down. Vandals, they said. Kids, maybe. Random mischief. Just as well. The FBI sent out regular alerts to its field offices nationwide. The man had disappeared. Maybe he killed himself already. He had not. He had joined the Lutheran church and bought a trailer which was in walking distance of his job. He moved on to be a chef at a country club, tried to get back into accounting, met a widow named Dolores Miller, and, after dating for a few years, they married in 1985. He told her his wife had died of cancer and that they'd had no children. It explained his reticence to talk about his past life, she thought. The Clarks' next-door neighbor, Wanda Flannery, found Dolores' husband Bob to be almost without a personality. That is, whenever they would talk, she noticed he offered nothing of his past for them to, bond over. She thought him odd in his stiff manner of dress and his fastidiousness and other things, but Dolores seemed happy enough. There was that one time that Wanda had picked up a News of the World, a tabloid rag that had once been the world's highest-selling English-language newspaper. In it, she had seen a piece about a man who had killed his family back in 1971. They showed a rough sketch the FBI had done. Wanda thought it looked like Bob, right down to the surgical scar on his neck. Dolores didn't see any resemblance. That Wanda, what a silly goose. What an imagination. Wanda asked her to mention it to Bob. Dolores said she would, but she didn't. The Clarks eventually moved into a house in a different neighborhood away from Wanda. It was a house they could barely afford with Bob's ever-present employment struggles. He was good about taking a few jobs at tax time, but he couldn't seem to hold down anything permanent. Dolores was just about ready to call it quits. The Westfield police, meanwhile, were not. The news about the slaughtered family had made them a national spectacle for a time almost 20 years earlier, and they had not forgotten. They were not willing to surrender their efforts to find some kind of justice for those John List had executed. Justice, too, they figured, for their town. Even though some of the police officers who had worked the case had moved on or retired, this was still an open case. Truth was, wrote Sharkey, the rank-and-file cops of Westfield had made List a kind of inside joke of sorts. They would regularly send postcards from places where they vacationed. Notes like, "It's nice not to have the kids around this vacation. Best, John List." Or, "Wish you were here. Your good pal, John List." That damned John List would send kind regards everywhere he went, from Disney World to Santa Claus Village. Brian Gillette, the prosecutor in the case, told Forensic Files,
"Once in a while you'd get a sighting, a List sighting. You'd get a report that they saw a guy in Alabama who looked like John List because the FBI kept information."
Bernard Tracy, one of the officers who'd been present at the crime scene and was now a detective, explained that
we would call the newspapers and we would insist that they keep it alive on the 5th anniversary, the 6th anniversary, the 15th anniversary. We kept it alive.
Detective Frank Maranka got the case assigned to him in the late 1980s. And Frank Maranka watched television, which gave him the idea to contact America's Most Wanted, the Fox TV show hosted by Adam Walsh's bereaved father, John. It had just debuted in 1988 and was only on 60 channels across the country. At first, the show's producers had shied away from the case. They saw little chance of it being solved. But Maranka pushed, and John Walsh got wind about how this father had killed his children. Here's John Walsh talking to Jessica Remo of NJ.com.
What made up my mind is I got a letter from the youngest son's best friend who said, "I have visited my friend's grave every 2 or 3 months for the last 18 years. I am begging you. This horrible guy murdered my best friend."
Walsh was determined to cover the case, but he needed to figure out how he could breathe new life into it. He got an idea. Now remember, this is before a lot of the sophisticated forensic methods law enforcement uses today were even thought of. But America's Most Wanted had already used age-progressed photographs, and Walsh had wanted to use the more interesting discipline of forensic sculpting to get a 3D image of the now 64-year-old List. Frank Bender was the best forensic sculptor in the business at the time.
I work with physical anthropologists, I work with odontologists, forensic dentists in other words, pathologists, detectives.
From skull to face, Bender refers to special charts that measure facial tissue thickness based on race, age, and gender.
More important than the facial tissue thickness is paying attention to the forms in the skull, the nuances, the differences, the asymmetry. What makes this skull different from the others? And they're all different.
Helping Bender was forensic psychologist Richard Walter, who predicted just how List would age, how anxiety would rest on his face, how genetics would alter it, how his lack of vanity would show itself.
Tonight on America's Most Wanted.
Now tonight's first case, the oldest we've ever pursued on America's Most Wanted.
As it happened, Wanda Flannery and her daughter Eva Mitchell were watching. The first voice you'll hear is Eva's, the second is Wanda's.
And it just all started adding up gradually. That he was an accountant and a Lutheran, and that he had a scar behind his ear, and that he was well put together and a classy dresser. By the time they got to the sculpture, I was convinced it was him.
To look at it, you would have known.
And the clincher for me was the glasses and the jowls.
We said, "Oh my God, that's Bob."
Bob is John List. We've got to call.
They punched in the numbers shown on the screen. The show had Westfield police and FBI agents on hand to answer questions or take down leads. Flannery's tip looked promising, so it was soon sent on to Kevin August, the agent in charge in Richmond, Virginia. 2 weeks after the show aired, August went to the Clark home to speak to Bob, who wasn't home. He and his partner talked to Bob's startled, disbelieving wife, who told them where they could find him. The agents then drove to the strip mall where Bob Clark worked in a small accounting office as a junior accountant of sorts. He was coming back from the copier when he saw them standing at the reception desk. This is August speaking to Forensic Files.
I approached him and I asked him, I said, "Are you Mr. Clark?" And he said, "Yes." And then I said, "Are you John List?" And he says, "No, I'm Robert P. Clark."
August noted that the accountant did not ask why they were asking. He didn't ask what John List had done or express any outrage at being asked. They found that odd. List was put in handcuffs as the FBI had enough probable cause to search his office, his home, and his history. They took his fingerprints and compared them to those in the long-ago files of the Westfield police when John List had gone in 1971 to get a gun permit, which he never returned to pick up. Fingerprints were required to obtain the gun. He had freely complied. Within an hour of his arrest, it was confirmed that he was John List. John Walsh again.
Do you remember when you got the call that he had been found or captured?
I couldn't wait to call Frank Bender. I could not wait to call Frank and say, "Frank, you know how they're laughing at you and me about using a bust on television of a bad guy? Well, guess what? That son of a bitch is in handcuffs."
Walsh would later call the arrest of John List, quote, "the capture that launched America's Most Wanted." Bob Clark's wife, Dolores, stood by him.
"I do not believe it. I love my husband very deeply. I do not believe this is the same man."
That is, until she did. The trial was uneventful, except for the protracted legal fight over the admissibility of the letter that was addressed to the pastor Redwinkle. The defense argued that it was privileged communication between a man and his confessor. The prosecution argued that there was nothing in the letter that indicated it was meant to solely be read by the pastor. The judge admitted the letter, which did a lot of the work for the jury. Before giving List 5 life sentences, Judge William Wertheimer looked at the timid, wan, and thoroughly unknowable defendant and nearly spat as he said,
"John Emil List will be eternally synonymous with concepts of selfishness, horror, and evil. He is a man who could coldly, calculatingly, and cunningly conceive and carry out a cowardly plan to assassinate each of his 3 children."
In 2002, List spoke to the media for the first time, granting an interview with ABC's Connie Chung.
"Were you determined to kill them?"
Once I made the plan, yeah, then just like D-Day, you go in, there's no stopping them after you start.
You ate lunch in the kitchen where you had shot your wife in cold blood?
That's correct.
How could you?
I was hungry. It was just the way it was.
The rest of the interview isn't available online, but he told Chung that he knew it was wrong, even while he was doing it. He said he believed he'd see his family in heaven. He said, quote, "I feel when we get to heaven, we won't worry about these earthly things. They'll either have forgiven me or won't realize, what happened. I'm sure that if we recognize each other, we'll like each other's company just as we did here when times were better." End quote. In researching this, I came upon a very odd, albeit fascinating, remembrance of the List children in a YouTube feed called Morbid Midnight. The narrator, who rarely has guests on the show, in this episode interviewed his mother, who was 9 in 1971 and lived next door to the List family on Hillside Avenue. I can't really vouch for the authenticity of this, but I think there's a good chance it's true, as she offers up what appears to be unscripted insights, like that the children called List father, and that
I watched him mow that lawn every time I went there to play with them. Their father was mowing the lawn, John List, back and forth, the same direction, from the front of the house to the back of the house, front of the house, the back of the house. And that guy, their father, I thought he was so weird. Usually when people mow the lawn, they tend to look around, look at the ground, look back, look to the side about mowing the lawn, but his head never moved. His eyes were always straight, and he was like robotical in his motions. I just thought he was so strange. He never said hello to me. He never acknowledged my existence. He never came into the kitchen to say hello to his children. I never experienced a meal there. I never saw the mom walk around, and I never saw the grandma walk around.
The kids drifted after that one summer. Patty wasn't playing with dolls anymore. Boys didn't want to be seen playing with girls. Then, a few years later, when the tragedy was revealed, she said her mother tried to stop her from finding out too much about what had happened next door.
In those days, the newspaper was everywhere, so I did see photographs of their bodies in the ballroom, and I'll never forget that. It was like I felt that horrible pit in my stomach. I was crying, and I mean, we had the best summer together, and there were my friends, okay, that was 6 years later, but there they were, murdered in our favorite playroom, the ballroom.
Where, because the furniture was so sparse, the kids would race their bikes. No adult stopped them. No adult cared. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read Death Sentence, written by New York Times reporter Joe Sharkey, as well as a lot of the 1971 and 1990 coverage of the murders and trial in the New York Times and the New York Post. She listened as well to the New Jersey Star-Ledger's podcast Father Wants Us Dead, a multi-episode investigative project done by reporters Rebecca Everett and Jessica Remo. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.